Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be removing and installing brake lines on a 2003 Honda Civic using LinesToGo part number BL1127-SS. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2003 Honda Civic, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown in your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made using 304L stainless steel for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Make sure to depressurize the fuel system before starting the installation. Tools required: 8mm, 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, and 19mm sockets and ratchet, 10mm, 12mm, and 13mm wrenches, flat blade and Phillips screwdrivers, pliers and cutting pliers, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be easy. To depressurize the fuel system, locate the fuel pump fuse using your owner's manual and remove it. Start the vehicle and wait for the engine to stall. Make sure to replace the fuse once completed. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the 3 bolts that secure the first section of the plastic intake housing. Remove the tube from the passenger side of the housing and remove the housing from the vehicle. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts that secure the front of the air filter housing. Use an 8mm socket to loosen the band clamp that secures the air filter housing to the throttle body. Disconnect the intake air temperature electrical sensor. Reposition the clamp that secures the PCV tube to the valve cover. Lift up on the air filter housing to remove it from the vehicle. If the rubber grommet stays on the throttle body, remove it and replace it onto the air filter housing for an easier installation. Use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings from the master cylinder. Next, raise and support the vehicle and remove all 4 wheels using a 19mm socket. Underneath the driver's side of the vehicle behind the engine, use a 10mm wrench to remove all 6 fittings from the proportioning valve. If the fittings are seized to the lines, cut the lines using a pair of cutting pliers. Remove the primary and secondary lines from the master cylinder. Next, use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the left front flex hose. Remove the left front brake line from the vehicle. Next, use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the right front flex hose. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the right front brake line near the bottom rear of the right front wheel well. Remove the outer section of the right front brake line from the vehicle. Underneath the vehicle behind the transmission, open the plastic clip that secures the right front brake line. Remove the remaining section of the right front brake line from the vehicle. Underneath the vehicle at the driver's side rear of the front subframe, remove the fuel and brake lines from the plastic retaining clip. Next, use a pair of cutting pliers to cut both rear brake lines behind the front subframe. Remove both front sections of the rear brake lines from the vehicle. Next, use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings from the rear flex hose connections and remove the lines from the plastic clips. Remove the left rear brake line from the plastic clip on the driver's side of the fuel tank. Next, use a 12mm socket to remove the 3 bolts that secure the parking brake cables at the front of the fuel tank. Use a 10mm socket to remove the metal bracket that secures the fuel and brake lines in front of the fuel tank and remove it from the vehicle. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut both rear brake lines in front of the fuel tank. Remove the brake lines from the plastic clips underneath the vehicle. Remove both center sections of the rear lines from the vehicle. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the heat shield over the muffler on the passenger side of the vehicle. Remove the right rear brake line from the plastic clip located above the heat shield. Next, we will need to remove the bottom rear seat cushion to access the sending unit. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt at the rear of the seat towards the driver's side of the center seat. Under the front of the 2 outer seat cushions is a clip. Quickly lift up on the seat to disconnect the clips and remove the seat cushion from the vehicle. Next, use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the 4 screws that secure the sending unit cover. Lift up on the cover and disconnect the sending unit electrical connector. Disconnect the feed line by pressing in on the 2 plastic tabs to separate the quick connect fitting. Support the fuel tank. Use a 14mm socket to remove both bolts at the front of the fuel tank that secure the straps. Lower the fuel tank until you can reach above the front of the fuel tank and remove the rear section of the left rear brake line from the vehicle. Above the front of the fuel tank, remove the right rear brake line from the 2 plastic clips using a flat blade screwdriver. Remove the rear section of the right rear brake line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings from the right rear axle line and remove it from the vehicle. Next, remove the left rear axle line by removing both threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. To begin the installation of your new stainless steel LinesToGo brake lines, start by installing the right rear axle line labeled 06C into position. Start the threaded fittings into the wheel cylinder and the right rear flex hose. Tighten both threaded fittings using a 12mm wrench. Next, install the left rear LinesToGo axle line labeled 05C into position and start the threaded fittings into the wheel cylinder and the left rear flex hose. Tighten both threaded fittings using a 12mm wrench. Install the next rear section of the LinesToGo right rear brake line labeled 06B into position. Secure the line into the plastic clips located above the front of the fuel tank along with the clip beside the exhaust heat shield. Next, install the next rear section of the LinesToGo left rear brake line labeled 05B into position. Secure the line into the plastic clips on the driver's side of the fuel tank. Position the front of the lines into the plastic clips underneath the vehicle. Raise the fuel tank back into position and secure the front using a 14mm socket. Replace the metal bracket in front of the fuel tank and secure it using a 10mm socket. Use a 12mm socket to secure the 3 parking brake cables. Start the threaded fitting of the right rear brake line into the right rear flex hose and tighten the threaded fitting using a 12mm wrench. Start the threaded fitting of the left rear brake line into the left rear flex hose and tighten the threaded fitting using a 12mm wrench. Connect the supply line quick connect fitting at the sending unit. Connect the sending unit electrical connector. Replace the sending unit cover and secure it using a Phillips screwdriver. Replace the rear seat cushion, making sure to correctly position the seatbelt buckles into the cushion. Press down on the cushion to connect the clips at the front. Replace the bolt at the rear of the cushion using a 10mm socket. Underneath the front of the vehicle, install the front section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05A into position. Start the front threaded fitting into the top rearward central port and the proportioning valve by hand. Next, install the front section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06A into position. Start the threaded fitting into the top forward central port and the proportioning valve by hand. Connect the front and rear sections of the rear brake lines at the threaded unions, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connections. Use a 12mm and a 13mm wrench to tighten both threaded unions. Next, install the first section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04A into position. Start the threaded fitting into the top rearward port in the proportioning valve. Secure the other end of the line into the plastic clip on the passenger side of the firewall. Next, install the outer section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04B into position. Start the threaded fitting into the right front flex hose. Connect the two lines together at the threaded union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection, and tighten the union using a 12mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the fitting in the right front flex hose using a 12mm wrench. Next, install the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03 into position. Start the threaded fittings into the top forward port in the proportioning valve and the left front flex hose. Tighten the fitting in the flex hose using a 12mm wrench. Next, install the LinesToGo primary brake line labeled 01 into position. Start the threaded fitting into the bottom forward-facing port in the proportioning valve, along with the rear port in the master cylinder. Tighten the fitting in the master cylinder using a 12mm wrench. Secure the line into the plastic clip located on the inside of the left front inner fender. Next, install the secondary LinesToGo brake line labeled 02 into position. Start the threaded fittings into the bottom rearward facing port in the proportioning valve and the front port in the master cylinder. Tighten the fitting in the master cylinder using a 12mm wrench. Tighten all 6 fittings in the proportioning valve using a 12mm wrench. Secure the line into the plastic clip inside of the left front inner fender. Bleed all 4 wheels using a 10mm wrench, making sure to keep the master cylinder reservoir topped up with fluid. Replace the air filter housing back into position, making sure to slide the PCV tube onto the rear of the valve cover. Tighten the 2 bolts using a 10mm socket. Tighten the clamp at the throttle body using an 8mm socket. Connect the intake air temperature electrical connector on the driver's side of the air filter housing. Next, replace the plastic intake housing back into position. Place the tube on the passenger side of the housing. Tighten all 3 bolts using a 10mm socket. Replace all 4 wheels and torque to manufacturer's recommended specification using a 19mm socket. Reconnect the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. This concludes the installation of stainless steel brake lines on a 2003 Honda Civic using LinesToGo part number BL1127-SS. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992. Email us at info@linestogo.com or check out our website link below. And don't forget to take advantage of our free 2-day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you on our next video.